Hello everyone, welcome back. I've played a variety of different gacha games, from Blue Archive, Genshin, Honkai, Arknights, Tower Fantasy, and so on. And ultimately, you've probably seen a video at least once or twice on this channel regarding them. Some of them may have been taken down just because I didn't like my thoughts in that video or wanted to revisit them later on. And I do especially intend to do that for older videos that I did previously, to better illustrate and discuss my points, because I do feel like they were pretty inaccurate or pretty terribly stated before. But today's going to be a very chill video. It's not going to have as much editing as my previous ones. And I just want to discuss my gacha games, as in the gachas that I played most and what I look for when I determine if a gacha is really good to me, as well as the importance of characters and story development, because I do think there are two different factors. You could have a really good story in a gacha game, but really poor characters. Because they rely so heavily on a vast roster of units, that you can have units that are dramatically different in terms of characterization and effort put into them. For instance, you could have units that are core to the actual main story of the game, feeling and sounding wonderful, whether that be with better designs, better voice acting, or better dialogue, or even just better written information, compared to a side character who you will ultimately never meet, or maybe you won't meet at all unless it's in an event. So I want to take the time to discuss that, because I have played a variety of different games, not just gacha but otherwise, and I have seen really good stories and really poor stories, or really good characters ruined by terrible main stories. And keep in mind, everything stated here will be my own opinion. And we're also going to bounce over different topics like communities, like the actual gameplay mechanics, like certain things like skills and combat power, and how that can help illustrate a character. I'm primarily going to talk about either dialogue, events, story-related scenes, things like that. Now, understand that because there are so many different styles of gameplay, whether you're talking about something like Nikke, which does have really beautifully animated characters on screen, and the models do move a slight amount. And considering the game just released, we also have to consider the fact that that game has English voice acting as well as different language voice acting right off the bat. Meaning that if you're an individual who doesn't like to read text, you have a much better time and are much more likely to enjoy that story and the story of other games with English voice acting introduced at the beginning of them, compared to something like Arknights, in which if you're looking at all the characters currently, they don't all have English voice acting. For me personally, I'm indifferent to either one, considering there have been some really bad English voice acting in certain gacha games and some really great ones. With that being said, I'm going to primarily evaluate the three main gacha games that I've covered on this channel: Blue Archive, Arknights, and Genshin Impact. Starting off with Blue Archive, most individuals here know my thoughts on the game. I perfectly enjoy the storytelling, and I do enjoy the characters. I think that even if you don't pay attention to the main storyline of the game itself, the characters have their own relationship stories, and subsequently they have their own little club stories or little event stories. Both of these are fine. In fact, they're wonderful little features that can grab you and pull you closer to the story or closer to the units in the game itself. And I've done them for a pretty wide amount of students, even ones that I don't necessarily actively build or enjoy too much. I still enjoy the relationship storylines themselves, and the live today you get at the end is just a bonus. As a direct result of that, I think Blue Archive does a really good job of getting you attached to the story in other ways than just focusing on the main quest line. And I think that a lot of individuals would much prefer to have something actively on screen rather than being able to read something elsewhere. Excluding the fact that the relationship storylines are replayable, if we're just referring to them in Blue Archive's isolation, and we're just referring to each character on their own without any assistance of their club members or the main storyline, I think it's a pretty wonderful feature in itself. You get small pockets of a character's personality, whether that be from the idle animation that shows when you pick them up, to their scale animations, or the animations when they're running around on screen during combat. Every character has a personality that actively, to some degree at least, bleeds through with their designs and animations themselves. And I think this does help because it lends each character a bit more uniqueness in of themselves, to an extent to where you can pretty comfortably identify them all one by one, or at the very least recognize some degree of an aesthetic or trait or viewpoint they may have. If we're comparing this to Genshin Impact, well, I made my previous Genshin Impact video, go watch that if you haven't already, and I ultimately do and can say I enjoy that game's story pretty well. Don't get me wrong, I have a personal favorite characters like Zhongli and Raiden. From a design perspective, I have personal favorites that look wonderful, and not just referring to their skills and animations, but overall just the color scheme of their outfits themselves. I think that Genshin has arguably the easiest methodology and the easiest time adding a personality or showing the personality of a character through the designs, because the idle animations, like Hazel for instance, will actively utilize something on his outfit. Whether they be the archons and their associations with their elements, or the small little things like the rock floating around Zhongli, Sayu and her sleeping animation, and so on, they have 3D models, so it's very easy for them to do an animation or create an animation or an idol or a voice line that plays whether it's raining, whether it's sunny, whether it's cold, etc., that fleshes out the character slightly more than you otherwise would get if they were just a static entity. Adding on to the fact that you have hangouts for 4-star characters, that you have main quest lines for 5-star units, And you have the Archon quest, which will usually introduce a variety and wide cast of different characters from that region, excluding the events themselves, which, as an example, the current event introduced Yai Miko, Layla, an upcoming 4-star unit. The previous event introduced Kale. You have events which drag in certain characters. If you're talking about the summer, you have Junyan and Mona and Kazuha being introduced and discussed about, and being given more additional features to their stories. I feel like if you're just looking at Genshin itself, the characters in that game, if you played from beginning to end at least and have played consistently, have the most fleshed out variations, just because they either get screen time at events or get screen time in main storylines or get screen time in other ways. And because of the variety and sheer amount of story content both on the character screen and the voice lines, it means that there's a lot for you to have in terms of value from them. If you get a character, you're likely to have a lot of content relating to them. Finally, we have Arknights. Now, I've played the game arguably equal to Blue Archive on my channel, which I'm meaning to sort of reduce and talk more about Genshin and other gacha games, other varieties of games here. But I've read the character profiles and the stories of the individuals who I like, such as Golden Glow, Mizuki, and so on. And I've also attempted, I'm not finished or at the end game of Arknights. I haven't gotten through all the chapters. I'm in chapter 4. And my overall opinion thus far is meh. The music in Arknights is wonderful. The character designs I quite like. But for me personally, the characters, the storyline of both the event and the main story itself haven't necessarily gripped me to an extent to where I would rate them or rate it on the same scale or level as Blue Archive and Genshin. And Nikke has obviously the relationship features, and I think that it's much easier for me to get attached to a character if I can actively experience something with them through that manner rather than the files that I can read in Arknights. And I understand there are multiple ways, but if I'm looking at it what's more easily available, then that is the methodology I go through. And if I'm talking about the main storyline, well, I've already mentioned that I don't particularly care for the main story of Arknights. And whether that's blasphemy or not, I ultimately can say that whilst I can enjoy the music and the gameplay style of Arknights, I could realistically care less for the story. And even the characters I like, after reading what's available on them and after reading more information about them, it's not much that interests me. Maybe that will change later on. It's why I haven't necessarily done a full-scale video on the story of Arknights. I don't particularly like it, and I don't particularly feel like doing a review on it, and as a direct result, I don't feel like it's fair to review the game or review the story of that game with that in mind. But ultimately, I think identifying a good character that's been made, whether that be from a design perspective or a gameplay perspective, is very important. I think if you can get attached to a character early on, prior to summoning them, it just makes getting them much more worthwhile. If you're not a meta player, then obviously you want a character with good designs. If you want a character with good designs and they happen to have a great personality and a great skill set, then you're obviously much more happier long term. So I will make a full video dedicated to Blue Archive, the Genshin story. I think I already have made that before. Go watch that if you haven't already. Alongside a full-fledged video dedicated to both Nikke and Arknights story. Arknights will take longer because if I don't or am not interested in that game story, I just won't make the video, as I don't feel like that's fair to the game itself. With that being said, I think that a character's story or character's unique personality can really affect whether you pull for them or not. Because if you just enjoy the gameplay, sure, you're getting value out of them, but not as much as somebody who also enjoys the personality. And I think that the more effort a game can put into making a unique and likable character, or a character with traits that you don't necessarily see super often in other units, the more fun and the more likely individuals are to just pull them based on that alone. But with that being said, I want to hear your opinions. I want to hear what characters you like. I want to hear who you summon for and what you enjoy most about your favorite gacha games. I intend to branch out, join the Discord server if you have not already, so that way you can be a part and I recommend or even give me advice on newer games that I choose to play, and obviously be a part of future server events. Either way, subscribe, I'll see you next time, and goodbye.